It is. Well, how are you? Thank you very much. I know, but sometimes there's some really good
out and about again. On behalf of the Limerick Writers Centre, can I say a céad míle fáilte to you all here tonight, and especially a céad míle fáilte to Sheila, who we had the privilege yesterday of celebrating a special birthday. So thank you.
Welcome to the senior team.
So, well, tonight's book is already launched. As we know, Des came all the way from Dublin just to have another. Just in any case, can I first and foremost ask you to put your hands together for John O'Sullivan? I suppose the name is well known to us all. Former Minister and TD. Thank you, Marion.
Thanks very much. First of all, thanks to Des for asking me to speak tonight, and to the Limerick Writers Workshop for organising this. I'm just delighted, first of all, to launch it, and more particularly to have had the opportunity to read it, because it's a great read. It's a fantastic read. And I suppose before I talk about the book, I just wanted to say a little serendipity that happened to me when Des rang me and asked me to speak, because as you probably know, the great travel writer and amazing woman, Dervla Murphy, died at the age of 90, I think, fairly recently, and I had read some of her books, but not all of her books, so I decided I'd go back and read one or two of her books. So I bought a book about Cuba that she wrote about Cuba, and it's called The Island That Dared, and it's a great book about Cuba if anyone's interested. But I had just finished reading The Island That Dared, and Des asked me to launch or to speak about a book called We Dare to Dream of an Island of Equals. So I thought, you know, that's definitely I should be speaking about this book. But then I got it and I read it, and I have to tell you, it is a fantastic. For anyone who hasn't read it, you have to read it. It's first of all, it's written from the point of view of Des's family, but it's also a history of all of the struggles for the last 100 years in Ireland. Struggles in particular of people who want a more equal Ireland, who wanted to change the things that were repressing people in Ireland, and a whole lot of other stuff about living in the heart of Dublin, about Irish music, the Irish language, etc. But above all else, it is about, from one family's point of view, it's about all of the changes and all of the things that happened in those last 100 years in Ireland. And it's set in the heart of Dublin and the Liberties. But in many ways, you know, a lot of what you read in that book, you could talk about this part of Limerick as well. You know, things like, for example, kids getting into trouble with the law for playing football in the street, or, you know, the street games. I was particularly struck by youngsters getting paid by the local pig keepers or animal keepers for bags of buckets of slop, which people around here would have done, because there were pigs kept literally in the backs of the houses a stone's throw from here. So it very much resonates for anyone who grew up in the city. But it's about Des's own family, and he had the most amazing parents, Tom and Lily, and they were extremely, first of all, concerned about everything that was going on, but very involved in struggles for equality. And his mother in particular, were really, you know, she was a feminist before we knew the word. She was a woman, a fierce woman who stood up for herself and stood up for her family. and wasn't going to be beaten down by anybody. And there's a couple of incidents in the book. One where, in the very early stages, where she's young, her mother sells newspapers at the corner of the street in Dublin, and she's to go and collect them in the station. And she has to beat off some fellow working in the station who tries to rope her. And she just doesn't allow it to happen. There's another incident where the parish priest invites himself into her house, and he's inside the sitting room, and he's looking at the bookshelf, and he starts giving out because she has banned books on her bookshelf. So she basically shows him the door. She says, "Bye now, Father, I have to go." And there's other ones, where she's haggling for the right price for food, where she's standing up to anybody who tries to put her down in any way. But she was involved in a group, as was, I think it's where Des's parents met actually, a group of left-wing people in Ireland in the early stages of the Republic, or even, around that time when the state was just being formed. And they were left-wing. They discussed all kinds of issues, and they were talking about how to change Ireland and how to have a progressive, open, left-wing, real republic. And both of Des's parents were involved in that group. And they used to meet in a place called Connolly Hall in, I think it's Great Strand Street, Des, is it? Yeah. And what actually happened to that group, and you'd wonder what Ireland could be like if that kind of thinking and discussing was allowed to flourish and allowed to happen at that time. But there was a mob that were trying to stop them, that picketed them, that pushed fire things in through the letterbox and actually burnt down the building. And nobody stopped them. The guards didn't stop them. They actually burnt down the building that these people were, having their left-wing discussions about the kind of Ireland that, and it really struck me that if that kind of thinking and discussion and thought had been allowed to flourish at that time, we could have a very different Ireland today. It wouldn't have taken us as long as it's taken us to, get rid of all the oppression, get rid of all the conservatism on a social level, which largely through the struggles which Des and his family were involved in, have been largely eliminated. But it's taken a long, long time. For example, the repeal of the 8th only happened recently. The marriage equality only happened recently, and so many more of those kind of social struggles. But the struggle for equality, in terms of economic equality, is a struggle that very much still goes on, and it's a struggle that Des and all of his family were involved in, and Des in his trade union activity and so on. And I think, one of the things that I like about his family and that is so admirable is that they didn't just dream about an island of equals, they actually fought for an island of equals and worked for an island of equals. And I think I'm talking to many people in this room who would have been involved in those kinds of struggles as well. And I think that's so impressive in the book. And I was just talking to Des earlier on about Jim Kemmy's anniversary. It'll be 25 years dead in September. And we're involved in, at the moment, organising a commemorative weekend. But many of the things that we saw here in Limerick in Jim Kemmy are the kind of things that Des and his family were struggling for in their situation in Dublin. And it's very well portrayed in this book. Des, as we know, was very much involved in trade unionism, but also in a whole lot of other things, like the bread and the roses as well as the bread, and huge involvement in traditional music, as many people here know, and also in terms of the Irish language. But the book is, it's very entertaining, first of all. It's very much told from the perspective of the individuals and how their life was, and how they wanted to change things and how they worked to change things. And for that reason, it gives you a snapshot of Irish history through the vision of the eyes of Des and his family. And for me anyway, those of you who went to school, when I went to school, we didn't actually do any modern Irish history. We did some history in school, but stopped. It was all about battles long ago and men fighting each other in far off places and so on. A bit about fighting each other in Ireland, but nothing of the modern, and certainly nothing of the life of the ordinary people, and you get that very much in this book. And I suppose the other thing that I wanted to say is that in the last chapter, I think what Des tries to do, because in many ways, you know, that struggle was so important, but it was so repressed and it was so hard to make progress because of the conservatism of the country over the years. But he points to, you know, what do we need to do now, I suppose, and where do we go from here? You know, we live in a very different world. We need to have the struggle for the ecological future, for the future of our planet, and also the fact that now there's so much mobility. People are moving around. You know, every society now has a mix of cultures, a mix of backgrounds, a mix of ethnicity, and so on. And what we need to do is to embrace that, and to embrace that world of all of us contributing to the Ireland that we know, but also to the world. So, you know, it's about, I suppose, social progress, but it's also about ecological progress, and it's about economic progress. I think above all, the message in this book is, you know, that we are nowhere near an island of equals yet, but we need to continue to struggle to get ourselves to an island of equals. And it's very refreshing to see that there were people, you know, engaged in that struggle for so long and so passionate about it, and it has been handed on to us. And while we have made progress, we've a long way to go still. But I think above all, this is a great read. And it's a read about real human beings in all their struggles, but in all their strength as well. And if I did pick out Lily, Des's mother, she was the one who really struck me, I suppose, as somebody who would see myself very much as a feminist. But I don't think I knew that there were women who, you know, were that strong, who would speak out like that at that time. I mean, another incident with her is in that Connolly Hall discussion, she argued with Peadar O'Donnell, I think, about something or other, and I think you'd have to be brave to argue with Peadar O'Donnell, but she wasn't afraid of anybody. And, you know, I suppose that's a lesson to us all as well. Not to bow our heads, not to be afraid of anybody, but to get up and fight for the kind of Ireland that we want to have. And that is more about cooperation than about competition. And it's about working together, and Des has some good ideas on that towards the end of the book as well, because we have to, you know, we can't be in the past. We've got to see the world as it is now, and we've got to make the changes that we want in what is a world dominated by global capitalism. But there are a lot of people around, and I think most people in this room tonight, who don't want our world to be dominated by global capitalism, who want a world where everybody has opportunities and where we work together rather than trying to climb over each other to get somewhere. So well done, Des, and thanks very much for the opportunity and a fantastic read. Thanks.
the man of the evening, Des Geragthy, from one trade union member to another. Welcome aboard.
First of all, I'm delighted to be here in Limerick to meet old friends and new friends. A very fond memory of Jim Temming, I hear it mentioned. He was one of the stalwarts. Himself and Michael D. Higgins were two of the best politicians we ever produced, and they stood up for democracy, but against all the odds in the old days. But anyway, and John, thanks for such a beautiful introduction to the book and a recommendation. It was very gracious. Thank you very much, and appreciate that. And you spotted the real hero in the book, was my mother. No question about it in my mind. This book was written actually during the COVID, when I was wondering what to be doing. I was busy with it. And this publisher said, "Would you write a book?" He wanted me to write about something totally different. I said, "No, I write about my mother." And it started there and so it went on, so I tried to sit down a bit about the foundation of the state. And it made me think back that one of the things James Connolly said, just listening to the radio down here, he said, if we have partition in this country, we're going to have a carnival of reaction. We're going to have sectarian states, and we're going to have a holding back of the progressive movements in the country. That's true, 200 years later. And I was listening to them talking about putting stuff up on working class kids in the north of Ireland. A lot of them unemployed, incidentally. And they're putting big stickers up, and they want to burn edifices of decent people who want to kind of work it with the community. And it's really sad that 100 years after the foundation of the state, and that's what we've inherited, unfortunately. Now, just for a bit of information, that picture on the front of the book is my uncle Jack. Jack was my mother's brother. And if any of you are familiar with Sean Casey, he was a character I always believed he was the young Colby in the pub, talking about Karl Marx when Sean Casey in the pub, and there's clown stars. He knew old Casey well, and was known him. He went around with a little book, and he actually did not trust the new leadership of Sinn Féin, because he remembered a lot of them back William Mark Murphy's in the 1930s strike. A lot of them, in fact, were the people locked out, the workers, and had no problem getting or at the time the DMP in Dublin and the British Army to smash the strike. And yet later on they became the leadership and became the Free State leadership afterward, people like William Cosgrave. And I've quotes of Cosgrave in letters and in this book. But first and foremost, those of you read it, I hope you'd enjoy it. It's from my point of view, it's full of spirit and memory of really decent, ordinary people who struggled through all kinds of times, and they all had a dream of a better Ireland, an Ireland that we hope we can build eventually in North and South, to get away from this sectarian bigotry, which is actual nonsense in today's world if you think about it. You think about the population of this country now, the way it's changing, the different religions. I was listening to someone talk about humanism on the way down, wouldn't have been talked about 10 years ago. And with people from every part of the world, and I have a great belief in pride in identity, but I'm arguing in the book, our human identity is the one we have to put next one in the future. And that's what concerns us about Ukraine, Africa, and as we starve people because of not dealing with climate change, that human identity has to become the strongest one of all. So it won't be Catholic, Protestant, or whatever, with a lot of other identities, but I think they should merge into a humanism. In other words, a kind of concept of humanity. That's the identity, it's the most important, because the earth is fading beneath our feet. And if we don't get that identity back right, we won't be going anywhere. So just a few little references. I was really chuffed when I sent the script originally to a number of people, and I got a great response from Sean Casey's daughter, Siobhan Casey, in London. And it was really, I didn't expect that it would be, she wrote, which is really, I'd like to refer you to it. Yeah, she said in her endorsement, which is in the book, she said, "We Dared to Dream" could be a companion to Sean O'Casey's autobiographies. It's an important book which flows from Des Geragthy's strong mother, Lily O'Neill. And it's woven through his family history in a struggle for workers' rights in the face of powerful employers and conservative church and state. It's also the history of the Irish trade union movement and its connections to Britain and the USA. Des and four brothers came to hold important positions in the trade union movement. But as Des says, many battles have yet to be won, with many more hills to climb, to create the Ireland of equals that our family of seven and so many others dared to dream of. And that was true. Now, just a story about Uncle Jack is this. When the Republicans fell out over the treaty negotiations, himself and Liam O'Flaherty and about 200 unemployed people took over the rotunda in the city of Dublin. And they made the mistake of putting up the red flag over the rotunda and saying, what about the unemployed? They're all talking about, De Valera was talking about Plan B and the oath of allegiance and there was Republicans. But actually, Dublin was crawling with victims of the 1480 war, blind, bewildered, injured soldiers, poverty-stricken people who wanted the War of Independence and absolutely nothing. And they wasn't even in the picture, and a lot of our early historians didn't even mention them. We hear about the fallout between Michael Collins and so on and De Valera, but actually the city of Dublin was crawling with poverty and unemployment and real destitution. And this attempt that they made, in their own way, with a few revolvers incidentally, which they didn't use, they gathered with fruit and they took over the rotunda and they put up the red flag. But once they put the red flag, the mad crowd was organised by the clergy and by various others to burn them out and attack and they were attacked from all sides, and thousands together, and the Free State and the British Army who were still there stood by looking on. And eventually, after 3 days, they realised it was really dangerous, people were going to be murdered and so on. So they had to evacuate. And Liam O'Flaherty, the writer, you know, he had fled to Cork. My Uncle Jack had to go back to the old hovel he was living in, and a few of them had to hide for fear they would be rounded up at the time. But that was a little gesture against the Civil War. You know, that this was the wrong fight. This wasn't what we should be doing. And of course, we've suffered consequence ever since. Our politics has been divided by that Civil War, and in fact only crawling out from underneath it ever since. So that was a little bit of the history. That was painted by Harry Kernoff. And again, we should remember, Harry Kernoff was a Jewish Dubliner, and painted the city of Dublin, one of the best painters that we ever produced, in fact. But again, he was an immigrant, he contributed an awful lot, and he supported the labour movement throughout, tremendous fact. That was a painting of my Uncle Jack. We weren't working as the Dublin unemployed at the time. Just a few other references maybe that you might find interesting in the book. I also dealt with the fact my father had been forced to go to work in London as a young man. He was in the Fina area, and his father was completely opposed to him getting involved in him. So we brought him over to London at 15 years of age over to Manchester and stuck him in a job in a mill in Manchester and left him there and came back. So my father was an exile from a very early on. But curiously enough, he found the other Republicans and he got involved with fundraising in Manchester for the volunteers. So, and in the 20s he came back to Dublin. Much more influenced, incidentally, by the socialist movement in Britain, which he said he found, as he went to the co-op and to trade union meetings, they were sympathetic to the Irish cause, the Irish working class in Britain, and that he learned an awful lot from them, and that we should have a much broader vision of our struggle. That wasn't only just narrow national struggle, it was much wider and much more important, so that's important. I tried to deal with various events, some stuff that isn't written, by the way, very much. Under Ono Duffy, who became the fascist leader, who tried to bring people out to Spain, and with the support of the bishops at the time, rounded up people to go and fight the Republic in Spain, which had been an elected government, a progressive government in Spain at the time. But people forget he was the chief of police under the Free State. And he instituted a committee called the Carrigan Committee, which was to look into the morals and the behaviour of the Irish people. Never published its report. Never published its report. But they actually closed down dance halls, home dances, brought in all sorts of regulations and so on, secretly, passed through the door in the early Free State, and almost killed traditional music, by the way, because they put a ban on house dances, that was cross-bred with no dances, and every kind of ridiculous restriction. And the idea that motor cars were a place of sin should be barred. So the whole series of idiotic reactionary proposals which were regressive for ordinary people. And the law of unforeseen consequences did enormous damage. Now, the consequence of that, in my experience, and I went to work in London in 1959, I was only 17, and I was amazed by the number of people I met in England who left Ireland when they had a job here, even particularly young women, and told me that they left to get out from under the repression, the kind of life that they were being expected to live, particularly in rural areas. And they went to England and Birmingham, went into nursing and all sorts of jobs, and most of the workers were labourers, didn't have training, went into the building industry. But the interesting thing was, economic historians about, there were no jobs and white people left Ireland, they didn't actually get to what Connolly got in labour and Irish history, the social struggle, which was those people were being deprived of a right to have a proper existence in this country. And so not only were the farms not supporting them, but the factories, but their lives were full of repression. And women were particularly victims of that repression. And we're so up to the 1970s. Every kind of restriction, they were guilty of everything. Responsible for all the behaviour of the men, responsible for the children, and so on. So people flooded out of this country. Now, I had an interest from a young age in the Irish language. I love Irish poetry, still do, and really interested me a lot. I was fascinated in London to find that in the pub in Finsbury Park, incidentally, they had begun in 1959, they began to dig the Victoria Line, which was the biggest employment job in England at the time. There were 15,000 people. They were from Donegal, Mayo, Connemara, Clare, Kerry, all the western seaboard. Thousands of workers were died. A lot of them were killed incidentally, injured and so on that particular job. But I heard more Irish spoken in that pub in Finsbury Park than I ever heard in Dublin. And when De Valera and a lot of our leaders were getting up, Taoiseach, Michel Lamas and Cora, send their letters, passing through the city of Dublin, and the boat when I was going over, it was packed with people from the west of Ireland, with carrying a few sacks or a few, heading for to get work and employment to live by going to live in England, the old empire, that we had not long far back supposedly, and they didn't even see them. They didn't see them. There was almost nothing done about investment in rural areas and so on. We went through an economic screw in the 30s and very little investment. It took Lamas to begin to think differently to get some sort of change. So I tried to record some of that there, the humanity or the inhumanity of it. But also, we became the worst country in Europe for banning books under this Carrigan thing. They set up committees to investigate every book that was printed. And all our writers got out of the country, all the decent people, Clifford Joyce and Beckett and O'Casey, leaving the country. And poor little Edna O'Brien had it the same time afterwards. And John McGarren, who I knew was a teacher, he lost his job teaching because he wrote a book that didn't suit them. And the poor old Taylor and Nancy were nearly burnt alive because we're telling stories. So we went through a period when producing books became a sin. And it was so repressive, so stupid. And yet we were among some of the best literary characters in the world, writing in the English language during that period. But the door was the only thing for them to get them out of the country. So it wasn't just an economic repression, it was all social repression, it was an ideological repression, and indeed left-wing ideas wouldn't be voiced. Now I have to say, to correct the for the present, our modern historians have tried to rectify a lot of that. I think we're proud of them now. They've begun to dig deeper, try to get into the stories, get people to tell their own stories, what actually happened during their lives, get women writing more, telling stories about the ordinary people and how they lived. But up to that in school, does any of you remember being told about the 1913 strike? When a third of the population of Dublin were starved out on the streets. And when William Martin Murphy and Arthur Griffith and a number of very prominent Sinn Féiners were back in the attempt to smash Larkin's Union. And the attack on Larkin was, I think, it's an Englishman. The fact that they were Irish immigrants, but that we couldn't this Englishman coming in telling us what to. So be very careful about this pointing fingers at people who happen to come. And James Connolly was killed in Scotland, he's another foreigner. But we were never taught that in school. And then everything stopped in 1921 or 22, and we heard about Pádraig Pearse, and because he could be painted as a saint. I don't think he was, but I think he's a more decent man than that himself. But that's all we heard about. We didn't really get the social history. And incidentally, it's worth looking back that Connolly tried to rectify that when he wrote his book, Labour and Irish History. He tried to write the social history of what was happening to the Irish people. So I hope that this little book is a little contribution to carrying that forward up to the present time, and of some reflections on various things. And incidentally, our family were great fans of Noel Brown, Dr. Noel Brown. And the reason was, it was political, but it was also something else. When we were growing up, kids were dying of TB. And when I grew up to school, I spent the first year I was in school, 3 kids disappeared, and no one said it, so I disappeared. And I only found that afterwards they were dead. And they were just pulled out of school and they died. And their parents would be done, because it was so rampant in the 1940s and 50s, and they didn't know what to do about it. And we didn't have the hospitals, we didn't have the institutions to deal with TB. So, we've had AIDS, we have COVID, and at least there's a system there, and there's a health service, but there was no proper health service. There was no Department of Health even. And in fact, when Noel Brown became, the first thing he said, I was trying to deal with TB, and he decided to get people out of the city, out of the damp condition, into institutions where they could have fresh air, decent food, and so on like that. And he actually conquered it. But for his sins, he was beaten up by everything. All of the political parties, the bishops denounced him. The man was persecuted all his life. So I was very pleased. All of us were now delivering leaflets for Noel Brown, and probably your introduction to politics was my mother swore by Noel Brown and what he had done. He wasn't a clever politician. Someone said years afterwards, I heard said, he wasn't sufficiently bureaucratized to survive the system. He may make mistakes, but he wasn't. Yet he said things about Ireland and about what was going on that people didn't want to hear. But he was one of those voices. And Jim Kelly and Limerick you should be proud of, and Michael D. Higgins. And I saw Michael D. Higgins standing in Galway in defence of travellers who were being evicted in his own constituency, when nobody else would come out and stand with them. And Michael D. did that as an ordinary. So he's now a president, we should be proud of him. But that's where, the politics was so honest. He didn't matter, he was going to lose local votes and so on and that. But he believed that people shouldn't have been, and that was in Rahoon. It was known as Rahoonery. Families which have been driven out of an area that is totally unfair to the people there. So there's a lot of that there, but it's also a bit of fun. And I hope that if you read it, you enjoy it. I was always very proud of the fact that from an early age, my mother got us to read. We didn't get to big schools, but we read. We read everything. My father said, you won't get to college, we've no money, but you'll meet the scholars. So I think during my life I met a few scholars in my time. But the thing was that we learned to read, we learned to appreciate poetry, we learned to learn songs, and I loved the music and songs of the streets. And I think that in a way, over hundreds of years, we should also remember, it was through those songs and those poets that the ordinary people kept the spirit alive, that helped them to struggle through. And to this day, I think that's important. So I love seeing young people learning instruments, playing music, singing, acting, and so on. And that's very much a part of changing society. It's not all about pounds, shillings, and pence. And the other thing that's interesting about Irish music, if I may say, looking at the lads, it has never become as competitive as pop music or modern music, which is a business, you see. And as soon as you record, a manager gets a hold here, or a record company, and then it goes into big money, and big money, and big money. So the actual beauty and the love gets buried along the way. But the person that picks up a tin whistle or a concert, even if it plays with the neighbours, they might never get it, their neighbours, they never know they own their own village, or whatever. They carry a kind of a spirit with them about the music, and it's a way where people can enjoy themselves. And it's interesting how we turn to music when there's a death, if you want to remember people, at weddings, when children are born, when we want to have happy birthdays and so on, we turn to music and the culture. So I think it's a very much a fundamental part. And Mick have now been dealing with people with social problems and so on. They've discovered more and more music is a fantastic medicine. And song is something that people who go through depression better than a lot of tablets. I got to finish up so by just saying, look, thank you very much for inviting me to Limerick. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I spent a lot of time, and I have a lot of friends here, by the way, I dealt with for many years in the corporation. I think Paddy Kiley, I don't know if you ever met Paddy, was the Grand Secretary there, he was a great man. And we had a lot of very good people, shop stewards, in committee people, and they, over the years, kept the flag flying for Limerick and for the people in the council, in the corporation, and in the factories. And I was always proud to work with them, and I loved coming up and down and frequented this place quite many times over. I was 35 years working for the union, so I was in every village in Ireland at some stage or another. I love coming back and meeting people and having a chat, and I hope that if you do get a chance of reading the book, that you enjoy it. And anyone that can't get one here tonight, I believe it's in O'Mahony's, they have it in O'Mahony's. It's a battle to get this book into a lot of them. I didn't get, Tuberty didn't pay me, I sent it to him several times, never mentioned, so I mean, some might be the right colour or something, but anyway. Yeah, but anyway, maybe somebody will bring them up. Listen, thank you very much, lovely.
About all the new people now living in Ireland, and if we all remember, in the recent past, there was a ceremony in Killarney where a lot of people became Irish. They got their Irish passports for the first time. And if you think about it, those people are as much Irish today as those of us who can trace their family back maybe 100 years or 500 years. And I think that's one of the things. If we take this an island of equals and remember that anybody today who has that Irish passport, they're as equal as the rest of us. And let's face it, we have a lot in direct provision, etc., that deserves that same passport. So I would hope, thanks Des for entitling your book, An Island of Equals. And as a farewell now, Tom Muldowney, we can't have an evening out without Tom Muldowney. He's not from Limerick, but as he said to me earlier on tonight, he's in Limerick longer than he's been in his home place of County Leash. So Tom Muldowney will say a few words, and then maybe our musicians will entertain us again. Thank you.
Not accustomed as I am, it gives me time to find my notes. This has been a very enervating evening so far, and I'm afraid the previous speakers, Jan and Des, somewhat have preempted my endeavour, but what the hell? I'm here now for the next couple of minutes. The doors are locked. Anyway, speaking of which, and now as the late Tony Cronin might say, a certain circumstance, I first met Des Geragthy several years ago in the National Gallery. Michael Caine was also in the company, and he was having just purchased a copy of Irish writing from the 50s from me. It featured a piece by Samuel Beckett. I let him have it for buttons, really. Actually, I knew nothing at the time. Moving on to a sadder occasion, it was the night of Tommy Smith's funeral in Dublin. Tommy was the renowned proprietor, host, philosopher, sage, great lover of poetry and literature, who presided for many years in Grogan's Tavern, where some of the company here presided as well. As the night wore on, we were legless and lockless. However, because I had a longer chat, very convivial chat with Des that night, and we found ourselves, it being a spiritual house, no, we stayed away from the top shelf. We found ourselves outside several depth charges of the old black stuff. But because I hadn't made arrangements to stay over, and as Mick Lacey often says to me, you only had to give me the wind of the word. Our garden shed was your garden shed. Because of my tardiness and the joviality of the situation, I found myself at 6 o'clock in the Stygian darkness outside Euston Station, waiting for that damn station to open it so I could return to Limerick. And a little aside here, as Marion keeps reminding me, I'm not from Limerick, no. I'm from that rather turbulent Badland area, the Laois Kilkenny border, where cannibalism, it was rife actually. I was down at a jolly there on Sunday in my home village of Cullehill, and a rather attractive woman, former neighbour of mine, said, "The sister would love to meet you." Well, I would have loved to have met her, so many years ago. Met the aforementioned sister, and she said, "You know, there were two fellas in the parish when I was growing up. I loved you madly. The other fella is dead. Do you expect me to do the work of two?" says I. However, you know what this worthy woman said to me? You know, the first thing I'm going to do, Tom, when I get the as we call it, the Charlie Haughey stipend, ergo the travel pass, I'm going to head for Limerick. I wonder what Rio de Janeiro is like this weather. However, anyway, I just have, I'm going to read a little piece of Des's, but I happen to pick out a couple of salient points that he made, and let's not forget that the Ireland he writes so movingly about, it hasn't gone away. The men in the long frocks are still lurking in the shadows, my friends, and I refer to those dear old mandarins of Maynooth. For instance, in 1927, the Council of Irish Bishops in Maynooth had solemnly warned the public that the evil one is ever setting his snares for unwary feet. At the moment, his traps for the innocent are chiefly the dance hall, the bad book, the indecent paper, the motion picture, the immodest fashion in female dress. Jesus. All of which tend to destroy the virtuous characteristics of our race. Bring it on, says I. Anyway. I forgot the other reference. Anyway, there's a wonderful piece from a Brendan Behan pastiche, the leader of the band. You know, we were the leader of the band, we were banned all over the shop. But the Irish people prevailed and read the bloody book. And people incurred the wrath of the censorship board and the customs officials by bringing in that book, which was Ulysses, which funnily enough was never officially banned in Holy Ireland. And it's well worth the trouble of reading it, folks. Anyway, as an aside, and Des is no mean vocalizer, and even he has some poems to his name. And he fittingly finishes his work with a great tribute to a mighty maestro of the banjo, and the one and only Barney McKenna. We have a practitioner here, and you've been listening to him all night. Another Dublin man, Mr. Michael Lacey. However, Barney McKenna, in memory of a Dubliner, from royal meet the noble minstrels fled, with sundered harp and furtive tread, exiled to wander through a land of tears, sad melodies to whisper across the ears. Nothing left to save but a native pride, song and verse of an ancient tribe. Music gleams from the wailing wind, the crash of waves and the march of time. When in Dublin city new hope revived, pipers and fiddlers fine music plied. Strings were twanged in more vigorous ways when McKenna his inspired banjo played. Irish harps could again now beat to rebel rhythms rising from the deep. With nimble figures and a spirit rare, Barney's music rang out on the heavy air. To many well-worn songs a new life he gave, rolling tuneful notes in wondrous waves, like sunlight glancing on dark sullen streams, found gold and silver riches beyond our dreams. An unscheduled journey just began with Ronnie, Luke, Kieran and John, leaves blown together from different trees, mingled under a crest of a Rabelaisian breeze. Now his head he's laid down, perchance to dream of a timeless place, wherever his heart has been, where the rarest of music his spirit may play, for the wind and the waves to dance on the sea. So, ladies and gentlemen, we dare to dream of an island of equals by Des Geragthy. It's available here at the book table. Buy the damn thing, or he won't go home. A happy birthday. Thank you.
Tom, thank you. Am I forgiven for? Des wants a right of reply.
I just want to tell you.
This reminds me of trade union meetings all the time. A right of reply. And Des, please, the floor is yours.
I just wanted to say a little story about Tom Barney and Kenneth. I worked in the PUT, which used to pretend to there were phones to people. Anyway, I went to a flat called the Clare, and I was there with the tin whistle. And Barney said to me, there's a great tin whistle player up in Spin, and you'll have to go up there and see him. A man called Fesky Conlon. And we said, oh, right, I think we were in Kilrush, so why don't we come up and we hitchhiked up to Spindle. Now, we arrived in Spindle without a bean, you have to admit, and we slept in a glass house or something like that, right? And we eventually found it. And we never went back to Dublin. And 3 weeks later, myself and Barney were getting a few bob playing here around Connemara, where they'd actually pay a few bob to play music, you see. And eventually the penny dropped that we're about going to lose our jobs in the PMT. So eventually I asked Martin Stanton, we're going to go Stanton's job in Spindle. Could he get a good doctor who'd give us a share? In those days, a share was more than he said, you sent you down to the local doctor. It's not going to give Barney and himself a share. So I thought that was wrong. I went back to Dublin, and I'm back at my job on a Monday morning, and the inspector sent for me. And he said, Mr. Geraghty, he said, you've been missing for 3 weeks, no communication, and I see you. I said, well, I was ill. You're not getting care. He said, yeah, he said, you were suffering from sunstroke. And he said, I just checked with the Met Office. It's been raining down the Spindle, he said, for the last month. You see, and then just as I was about to go, I said, do you know this down in Kennan? There's no Dubliner, I've never heard of. I said, I think I'm vague. Well, he was down there as well, and he had sunstroke as well. He said, you tell him, if he doesn't, he said, you tell him, if he doesn't stop drinking all night and get down off the poles, he won't be in the overhead, he'll be in the underground in the PMT. Barney gave up his full-time job and became a full-time musician. So when he died, I had to remember my fond friend Barney McKenna. That's what
Well, I must say from the trade union point of view, that's a better right of reply than I've heard in a long time. And any of us who have gone to AGMs and meetings, so I suppose one thing, I wouldn't be standing here. Listen, can I say to you, look, the membership of the trade union movement is not as strong as it used to be, and I would encourage everybody, anybody you know, because if we're looking at this, an island of equals, we'll only be equal if we're working together. So whether we're in the trade union movement, or look at a night like tonight, and we're all equals here, enjoying ourselves. So we need to remember that when we're moving on. Now, my last few words tonight is, can I just remind you, next Thursday, tomorrow week, we're meeting in number 1 Perry Square. And the reason we're meeting there is to celebrate a Limerick man originally from Ballinanty, who spent most of his working life in England, now resides in Westport, Tim Cunningham. And we want to get together and wish Tim a happy 80th birthday. So I would encourage everybody to come along. And it's 7:30 next Thursday week. And in the meantime, I'd say Ihawa to everybody, and the musicians will probably fill us up with one worker song for the night. Go on.
Thank